What's up, my people? Welcome to Fellowship Bible Church's Sermon Spotlight, where we're coming at you each and every week with a fresh weekend to debrief in an effort to send biblical truth. What better way to do that than by the power of conversation? I'm one of your hosts, Caleb Pearson. Joining me in the host spotlight, she's back with us, Miss Abby Lindenberg. Abby, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Happy birthday month.
Thank you.
Everyone's wishing you a birthday 2 weeks early, but it's part of the month, so it's a whole big thing. Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. He's back with us in the pulpit the week before and this past week, Mark Carey. Mark, how you doing, my friend?
Good.
Good.
Yep, we're good.
So we're launching Daniel, my guy.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? We're here. Look at us, huh?
Yep.
We made it. Who would have thought?
That's right. Who would have thought?
So we do this glory of God foundation, and now we have this book of Daniel introduction, and we talk a lot about geography, a lot about history, world leaders, kind of setting the stage, the context for that. I'll ask some questions about that, but Abby, I'll come your way first. What stood out to you this past weekend? What's your experience with Old Testament stuff like this? Are you grasping it? Is it all new? Because I'm kind of in a similar boat of like, I definitely did not know that. Who's that guy? But all that checks out.
Yeah. I appreciate the timeline because I think normally we don't always read the Bible chronologically, so it's kind of helpful. Like some of the stories I do know, some of them I don't. So it's nice to like have a timeline leading up to okay, now this is where we are in Daniel. But I did want to ask one question. You talked about Nebo and how that was like part of their names. Is that also like Mount Nebo that's in Israel? Is that
No.
the same?
My understanding is different.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was just curious.
I think.
Yeah.
That's a good question. I thought of that, but I didn't have time to go check it out. I don't know if there's a connection.
Gotcha.
Interesting.
But it's spelled the same.
Spelled the same. Oh, yeah. Nebo, the god Nebo, there's various variations. It can be Nabu, Nabu.
Okay.
Various, but Nebo is what. We should check it up. See if there's a connection between Mount Nebo, where Moses died.
Yeah.
And that'd be interesting.
Yeah.
Certainly. Of course, now that goes back hundreds of years earlier, centuries earlier. And did you ever take a world history class at university, at college, and stuff like that?
Just high school stuff.
I mean,
Yeah.
ancient Sumerian history and the Akkadian, the Gilgamesh epic, the various. There's of course, I find it all interesting, but there are this intertwining. God chose to raise up a people and to live out His purposes in a real world scene that He had created. And so that's the context. He's not, but it's not being lived out in the solar system or Mars or some faraway galaxy. It's here on this planet with real nations and real people. And so it is kind of all intertwined. So God's people, Israel, they were raised up in a particular geographical context, and Egypt was a real place, and there was while they were slaves there was real stuff going on in other parts of the world, and that were happening in people's lives, and gods and goddesses that were raised up. So to me, it's all very fascinating and interesting.
Yeah.
And so Mount Nebo, I'll have to look into that.
Yeah.
Maybe somebody listening knows.
So why would those details matter? I mean, you're talking about a church going through a book together, right? We're teaching expositional. Why take the time, and I think Abby and I know the answer to this, but why take the time to, okay, here's the map, here's what had just happened, and here's what is happening while we get this account. Whereas we could have just jumped right in and tried to read the whole chapter and then tried to jump to, okay, Lord, what about me? What's the application? Why take the time to introduce the book perhaps twice, once with the glory of God in mind and then once with the historical context in mind?
Well, number one, they're related. So this understanding of God and the vastness of God and the greatness of God, it sets the stage for some of the content of Daniel, because in the visions of Daniel, we're going to do real world national nation type stuff. So to me, it just kind of fits to see these I call it, that geopolitical intrigue that's going on, because God is intertwined and supersedes it all, and is over and all this. He's doing this. Like I mentioned, how Pharaoh Necho II of the Egyptians came up through that region of Judah on his way to battle the Babylonians, to partner with the Assyrians. If you go to that Second Kings, and it's written Chronicles too, that account, Pharaoh Necho says, God told me this, that Josiah, you stay away, because God is calling me. And the way it's written, it's almost assuming that it was Jehovah Yahweh God. That's how it comes across. That God told me, I'm doing his work, so stay away. And I have no quarrel with you, Josiah, because God is calling me. Well, it's just kind of like a throwaway verse in there that where did that come from? How? But it shows that God was moving this massive army of this nation, as he had moved this nation and army, and this is all according to some grand scheme. So again, it reflects back on the great glory of God that is overseeing all these things. And to put, I think, any study of the book, and I do this often if I'm going through an Old Testament study, put that in its context, in its geographical and its historical context. That's how we interpret Scripture as well. And it just it's getting that 35,000 foot. The glory of God was like a Hubble telescope view. Last Sunday, it was more of a 35,000 airline view of what's going on down here. And then we'll get into the microscopic views as well.
Sure.
But I think it's just valuable.
Yeah, which Daniel 1 wants us to know about, right? The text is the one. Here are the names and places, so keep that in mind as we unpack everything else that's happening. And it was a cool reminder to me of just like, God's been using this, and it is crazy and dramatic. So we can look at today's crazy and dramatic world and be reminded, okay, God's sovereign. Yeah. He's working here. He's been using this mess and these leaders in a similar way that he was using them.
And for the people say that Daniel, the original audience to whom this was written, or who would have read, there would not have necessarily been footnotes needed, Nebo. Or they would have known all that.
Sure.
It's their context. If we're going to come, we have to do a little extra homework to put it into, so we can understand it. And I think that's the value of it.
Yeah, it's good. You had mentioned this King Josiah. You went to Chronicles for a little bit as well. What is this Josiah's reputation as a king? And kind of a twofold answer. One is among biblical scholars, or the way people refer to him when they teach about him, but obviously even in Scripture himself. Is he highly regarded for what he tried to do and what he tasked people to do? Or is the moral of that story, it came up short because their hearts weren't changed?
No, you read the account in Kings and Chronicles. Josiah is very well respected. He is sincerely. I mean, we read that he did right in the eyes of the Lord. He turned aside. He didn't turn aside from the right or the left. He sought the Lord with his whole heart and soul. I mean, so he's spoken of very well, and he was God's man for those 31 years that he lived, even though he was a young boy to begin with. He was God's man raised up at that time, a breath of fresh air in an otherwise very foul, kingly lineage, coming off of Hezekiah. So yeah, he's spoken of. The problem that Josiah had is that he didn't have a chance. He did not have a chance, because if we go to it's 2 Kings 23. In 2 Kings 23, after talking about that in the opening verses, he talks about the reforms that he made and how he reinstituted the Passover that hadn't. In fact, it says in verse 22 of 2 Kings 23, surely such a Passover had not been celebrated from the days of the judges who judge Israel, nor in all the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. You mean David didn't? What Josiah did was, you couldn't go back to until Samuel for the way he did it, or whatever it was he did. It was rather unique, and he really listened to the law. When he saw those 5 books of Moses, I mean, he followed it, and it's a stellar reputation. It says, verse 24, moreover, Josiah removed the mediums and the spiritists and the teraphim and the idols and the abominations that were in the land of Judah and Jerusalem, so on and so that he might confirm the words of the law. I mean, Josiah was a Bible man. He was a book man, and he followed it. Before verse 25, before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses, nor did any wait a minute, what about David?
Right.
Or the early years of Solomon? I mean, and there were other good kings. But then verse 26 says, however, the Lord did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath, with which his anger burned against Judah, because of all the provocations which Manasseh had provoked him. Manasseh had done such evil, and the list of things that he did is the guy was just over the top wicked. Josiah becomes king, and it's like he didn't have a chance, because it was already set in concrete that God was going to judge Judah because of all the sins that his predecessor had done.
Carrying over,
Yeah. So, I mean, Josiah couldn't have done anything. It was ordained by God that judgment was going to come because of the evil of Manasseh. So what he did and what he accomplished, even though so much of it, he made the people do this. It was a forced thing. I think you've got to give Josiah high marks for the kind of man he was and the kind of king he was.
Sure.
But he didn't have a chance.
Yeah. So then, leading to his downfall, why would he want to challenge the Pharaoh? You know, if they're talking about the same God, or they seem to be.
Yeah.
And he's just trying to pass through. Like, what's
the who know? And commentaries I read and different things I've read, it was like kind of a mystery. Why? What got into his head? Because it's not a long description of that whole event. And the answer is, we don't know. We don't know. We can talk about it on a purely geopolitical human frame of mind. The aversion towards Assyria, the power of Egypt, and he's caught between the two. And here's this Babylonian thing, and so if the handwriting is on the wall that Babylonian has already defeated Nineveh, and Nabopolassar and probably more Nebuchadnezzar, his son, has pushed the Assyrian army. After getting defeated in Nineveh, they went to Haran. That's where Abraham had gone, and Terah, his father, had died there at Haran. They'd already pushed him out of Haran too. So the Assyrian army had retreated to Carchemish. That's when, so the Egyptians are coming, and it was like the world magazines were saying, the World News Tonight was saying, man, this Babylonian, this Nebuchadnezzar guy, if you're gonna throw your hat in the ring, throw it with Nebuchadnezzar. And so it's like he made a decision, I think, based purely on the economics or the wisdom of the time, just looking at a humanly speaking. I don't want the Egyptians, because they're right there, and the Assyrians are right there, and we know their history of centuries, and so I'm going to support anybody. So he did not want the Egyptians or the Assyrians to win. So he does something up there to try to block it, and he probably just didn't believe Pharaoh Necho. How that message came to him and says, "Look, get out of the way. God told me to do this." And yeah, sure, you're the Egyptian Pharaoh telling me that. We don't know. But And we don't know if God had communicated to Josiah. So we just don't know. What we do know is that he was defeated, and it says archers. He kind of disguised himself, and the archers killed him, and then his third son, I think it was, takes over the throne. It was probably a co-regency, and with Jehoiakim. And when Pharaoh's army is defeated up, no, yeah, is defeated up there, but they're on their way back. And when somehow the Egyptians enslave or exact tribute, a very high subject them to taxation, the Egyptians do. So Judah is really beholden now to the Egyptians until Nebuchadnezzar comes down in 605 after chasing them away, and then he handles Judah and subjects them at that point. So, for the next 19 years, Daniel is one of those young boys that are taken off in 605.
Mm-hmm.
Judah doesn't fall completely for 19 years till 586 BC.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of life and a lot of history that is done during that time, that almost 20 years. A lot of sad stuff. And the book of Jeremiah is the book that Jeremiah is there.
Weeping prophet.
He's there when in all of this. That's right. He's there at the fall of Jerusalem. We don't know what happened to Jeremiah. Some think that he ended up down in maybe in Ethiopia or fled, or we don't know. But
that whole area, what a focal point for God moving. And over the years, it's so hard to, even in our high school history class, memorizing what it was and when and how it all kept changing shape. And
so here's the question: is why? Knowing that, why would God tell Abram, leave in Genesis, leave your family, Ur of the Chaldees, and go to a land I'm going to show you, that promised land? There, I mean, why not, instead of going west, why don't you say just stay in Ur? It's a fertile crescent, bottom there, or go east,
right,
where maybe kind of an out of way I can work out my plans in a quiet sort of way and not worry about. But it's right smack dab there, kind of in that
middle of everything.
Right in the middle of everything. The trade routes, the war routes, the army comes and goes. To this day,
that's still the case.
That's where God focuses his whole attention and the plans of the ages, right in that area. Which is fun if you've ever gone there to walk those roads and walk those paths in those areas. Because that's where it's been at.
Yeah. It's crazy.
It is.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's just a cool reminder that the Lord's using it all.
Yeah.
Anything else? I have one more question for you, Mark, but before we get to that, anything from this weekend that you're like, man, I'd love to expand on that, or when I said this or that, or conversations? And if not, that's totally fine. But.
No, there is like 150 years earlier, or more, when Isaiah was writing, he mentions, and I was trying to, so in Isaiah 46, verse 1, he's writing about the judgment of Babylon, Isaiah is, and he actually mentions Bel has bowed down, that's Marduk, the chief god. Nebo stoops over. Their images are consigned to the beasts and the cattle. The things that carry are burdensome and load for the weary beasts. They stoop over, they have bowed down together, they could not rescue the burden, but they themselves have gone into captivity. So here's a prophecy that Isaiah is actually talking about, like when he wrote that, it's like Marduk and Nebo, Babylon. I mean, they're nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And here he's talking about Marduk, Bel, and Nebo will bow down and will be taken. Their demise, which we'll find in the study of the book of Daniel, that the world powers are going to shift and change. The Medo-Persian Empire is going to come, and Isaiah will talk about that. He'll raise up Cyrus, my shepherd, Who? That's why, by the way, this is another. Not that I would have ever included this in a sermon, but certainly in a study of Daniel. People, especially liberal writers, will say there's no way that Daniel or this thing I just read in Isaiah, they talk about there's a Deutero and Isaiah, that this second half of Isaiah must have been written long after, because you mentioned Cyrus or Nebo, Marduk and these things. Why, it must have been someone who knew,
Right.
like God can't foretell these things. Same thing with Daniel. All those things that we're going to read about and some of the details later in Daniel, it's like, how did he know that? It must have been written by someone who 300 years later wrote back about this stuff. Well, they just can't accept the fact that God can convey stuff that hadn't unfolded yet and to be written down. So the whole critical study of Daniel is fascinating. It's not for a sermon, but it is helpful to go and say, we can trust this word, and we can trust that it was written when it was, even though it's talking about detailed things that are yet to come, because that's God. God was informing his prophetic writers.
Which I think is becoming a fundamental question in churches today. How do we tackle the Old Testament? Or do we? Do we spend time reading it? And how do we honor the ironic New Testament passage that says, oh yeah, all Scripture is profitable, so let's, the whole counsel of the Lord.
Right.
And so that's the question, and Abby, you and I can share some thoughts too. How should one prepare, be it spiritually in their heart or even just systematically as they study, to apply Old Testament Scripture in their life while honoring that principle?
Yeah.
And what are some ways to make the book of Daniel resonate, but not to such a degree where you could say, oh, somebody must have written this 700 years later, or that part doesn't apply, that part's not important, but this is.
Yeah. Well, two New Testament passages come to mind. One is Romans 15:4 that says, whatever was written in earlier times, Paul wrote, was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance and the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. So why swim in this? Why study? Why read obscure people that happened 2,500 years ago? Because there was a sovereign purpose. It was written. Yeah, it was written for our instruction, so that through perseverance, through patient endurance, and encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. So we read and study those Old Testament Scriptures. It's to infuse in us hope, because nothing is new under the sun. After last week, someone came up and mentioned how, or this past Sunday, someone came up and mentioned how encouraging it is. I even use the word, because just as things and problems and national issues were plaguing those people 2,600 years ago, they are today too. And so to make those connections, that we need hope, and to know that there's a God who worked in these situations, it's helpful. And it's a call to persevere. The other thing is 1 Corinthians 10, when Paul is writing the Corinthians, and he's talking about the people of Israel, they all came out of Egypt and blah, blah, blah. And he says in verse 6, now these things happen as examples for us. These things happen to be an example for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also crave. So there again, why should we read this stuff? Because it says something about the character of God, and this is how he acted in the Old Testament. And guess what? He hasn't changed. So we have to guard against that. Verse 11 says, now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. So there's real value. There's great examples. There's great lessons that we can glean from there. 2 Timothy 3:16, all Scripture is inspired by God and is profitable for teaching, reproof, correction, training. So all these things that we read, God can teach us things about himself, his character, how he acted in the past. It's for reproof. What do we need to guard against? Training us in righteousness. So there's great value. It's God's written word that is inspired, this Old Testament. And when he said that, all scripture, he was talking predominantly about the Old Testament. So we should never ignore it, and we can easily make a case that spending time in it has great spiritual value. But like any Bible study, you have to understand it in its context and understand what was the original author, some intent here when the people read it, what was their intent, and then how does that transfer over to us today. But there's nothing new under the sun.
And that's the tension in the sermon as well, which I appreciated the application, and you specifically took time to talk to seniors and how can we take this seriously and look at the world and look at the application of it and realize, which was convicting for me, especially in my life and ministry and growing up in the church, like the Old Testament is not there for my burden, it's there for my benefit, but it feels like a burden. If I approach it wrongly, or it's just Mark, it's just not as easy to read as the New Testament. It's not as shiny, not as polished. Where's the Jesus guy?
Yeah.
But so you dig. And then that meta narrative, that God, he's there.
Yeah.
Right? 66 books whispering his name.
Yeah.
So find out how. And then I think then and only then we get to the application of it. Like so what about me?
Yeah. Well, and similar to how you were saying the historical context and geographical context is helpful for Daniel, the Old Testament is that same context for the New Testament.
That's right.
It just kind of gives us that lesson, that context for why things happen the way they did.
That's right. It's a combined whole. The scripture, the old saying is, the new is in the old concealed, the old is in the new revealed. So there is I think that's fairly accurate. It's a nice little pithy sounding thing, but it's there.
But you can see it.
Yeah.
Good.
So it's very valuable. Yeah, there's a lot of things that could have been added. I would have loved to spend more time with Jeremiah. Ezekiel was he was part of the second deportation. So when he saw the vision of the glory of God leaving, I'm sure that was shortly after Josiah was killed. And because Josiah's son, you keep reading in Kings and Chronicles, Jehoiakim, what are they thinking? They go back to doing bad stuff. And it's like, why didn't you teach your kids better that way? And then but Ezekiel is probably taken off in 598 in that second deportation. So the things he's writing are very interesting. But Jeremiah and Lamentations, you can, and if you wanted to, you can go back and read Nahum, that wrote about the fall of Nineveh when the Babylonians came there. And so it's there's a lot. There's a lot. That's where we have podcasts, but also biblical training centers, where that's the value of biblical training centers, because I'm not going to go in depth. Right. Can you imagine? People would be bored out of their mind if I said some of the stuff I'd love to say that I'm studying. And they would be like, "Oh, come on,
you gotta
Mark,
be kidding me!
Get rid of this guy.
Now's not the time for that."
That's right.
Yeah.
So
and that's the importance of community groups as well. Then get in a context where you can say, what stood out to you? What did you think of that? What does that look like in your life? So we can all kind of do this thing together.
It's fun. I hope that we walk away with the sense too that Bible study is exciting. It's fun. It's challenging, but it's inspired scripture, and God is going to speak through us through these stories and these accounts as an example of how we ought to live, that we will have encouragement, that we will persevere under the days we live in and have hope, as it says.
It's good.
Hey, I did want to mention.
Please do.
Not that anybody is asking this, but I did want to say, once in a while people ask about Bibles and study Bibles. So I just want to throw out, I've got multiple, study Bibles that I've acquired over the years. And just a comparison or contrast with some of them, the two study Bibles that I have found, just like in this last sermon or these passages that have the most interesting and helpful notes, the study notes. There is the New King James Study Bible that is done by Thomas Nelson, and they've got really, really good notes. I mean, they're more thorough than others. I also have the ESV Study Bible that is printed by Crossway. That is helpful. Doesn't quite have quite as many notes, but the New King James Study Bible has tons of them. And then I have an archaeological study Bible that just talks about those types of things, culture and archaeological discoveries, which I think it's fascinating to read.
Yeah.
Now it's going to be dated. I can't remember when it was published because they discover new stuff all the time.
Right.
But that's another thing. Like where do you get all this information about Nebo and Nabopolassar and all this stuff? Because they dig it up.
Yeah.
There's something called the Babylonian Chronicle, and it is. I can't remember. I think it was discovered maybe 100 years ago in 1921.
It's not a weekly newsletter.
That's not a weekly. It was. Yeah. Or there's something else called the
Babylon Bee. I read that
Babylon
one.
Bee. That's a little different. Yeah, that's right. Can you imagine digging that up 2,500 years from now? What were these people thinking? But there are
interesting though.
There are thousands upon thousands of artifacts. A lot of them in the British Museum or different places of things. Sometimes little pieces of little things, but like they found they saw written in there Jehoiakim. Or, so things that affirm the Old Testament. I remember when I was studying Isaiah, that not too long ago, maybe in the last 25 years or so, 30 years, they dug up near Hezekiah's tomb, the king, a signet ring. And on the signet ring, it said, the prophet Isaiah.
Wow.
In Hebrew, it might have been his own, ring or something. So there's so much that is affirming. Nothing has been disproven in the Bible over all the centuries of archaeological discoveries. That's another fascinating study. Is so when you get into these things, they're just not guessing about some of these things about Nabopolassar or Nebuchadnezzar.
Right.
There's stuff that's actually from that era. Their names are there. The cuneiform etchings are in there. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's exciting.
Very exciting.
Very cool. More to come, I'm sure. Mark, thank you for being here, brother.
Yeah,
I appreciate it. Abby, thank you.
Yeah,
appreciate it. For all our listeners and viewers, remember that we love to hear from you guys. You can send over your thoughts, questions, or requests at fbcva.org/podcasts. Write us your notes and comments. Also, be sure to check out our other podcast platforms on our YouTube page. The fact of the matter, everybody, is that sermons are not meant to take an hour, but rather transform a lifetime. Until next week, much love. God bless.